Hello and welcome to Heartbeat. This week, William sits down for a fascinating interview with journalist and broadcaster Tim Stanley. Catherine will bring us a roundup of news from home and abroad, and I'll give my viewpoint on the deadly drugs our politicians want to use for assisted suicide.
Tim Stanley is a journalist for The Spectator and The Telegraph. He is also the author of the thought-provoking Whatever Happened to Tradition. Tim regularly speaks out on life issues, and today I'll be talking to him about both the political landscape and the free speech landscape as they pertain to the pro-life struggle. So Tim, thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule to join us on SPUC TV. Now, party conference season has now come to an end, and I understand that you attended most, or in fact all of the major, all of the major political party conferences. Now, should we, as pro-lifers, from that perspective, should we have any hope that any of the major parties might roll back the culture of death?
I think reform might open up more of a space for pro-life activism. And given that reform is so far ahead in the polls, that should give people hope. It's significant that Danny Kruger, formerly a Conservative, has joined the party, because Danny was perhaps the biggest voice in the Commons opposing assisted suicide. And I think also, this might seem paradoxical, but we lost the assisted suicide vote, but it was much closer than we thought it would be, given the size of the Labour majority and the assumption that left-wing progressive people are always in favour of expanding the boundaries of death. Turns out not true. There are a lot of people in Keir Starmer's party who got elected who weren't prepared to discuss that issue, hadn't thought much about that issue, but in the process of debating it, have discovered a greater sensitivity on these issues than they thought they might had. I am told by a very reputable source that church attendance among MPs within the Commons, among some MPs within the Commons is up, has risen. And the thinking is that it's risen because of the assisted suicide debate. So on the whole, things look pretty bad, given the legislation that has passed, given that the Labour Party is overwhelmingly pro-choice, of course. But I actually think long-term, the emergence of reform, the growth of a greater sensitivity on life issues within Labour MPs, I actually think there's a lot to be hopeful about in Parliament. Interesting.
And we were pleasantly surprised to find unlikely allies in the likes of Jeremy Corbyn, Diane Abbott on the assisted suicide vote. Not just voting the right way, but also giving quite compelling speeches in Parliament as to why they were voting that way. Yeah.
The issue divided the liberal left and the socialist left. It wasn't a division on religious grounds, of course, whereas Tories who opposed it tended to be religious. It's a division on the grounds of constituency, that liberal left-wingers tend to represent the very wealthy kind of people who've been lobbying for this bill, whereas socialist MPs are more sensitive to the needs and experiences of poor people and non-white people and disabled people, all of whom are very sceptical about handing this kind of power over to the NHS. I was very struck by what David Lammy said about, he talked about people in his own family are the kind of people who would feel they wouldn't want to be a burden. And so I think in the course of that debate, a lot of left-wing people were forced to confront the reality of liberal individualism and its conflict with socialist values, where you want to be thinking always about the moral quality of the community and the needs of the most vulnerable people within it. I think the pro-assisted suicide lobby is a bit of a liberal individualist fantasy that everyone is rich, well-informed, and has the best medical treatment. Well, if you represent very poor people, you know that's not the case.
Yes, and they have to maintain that blinkered view. Otherwise, their whole argument falls apart, as we saw in the debate. Now, personally, having watched much of the debate in both the Lords and the Commons around Kim Leadbeater's assisted suicide bill, I was struck by just how poor the standard of debate was in the Commons, contrasted with how comparatively high it was in the Lords. I think specifically of Theresa May, who gave a really compelling speech and was brave enough to mention that assisted suicide is wrong in principle, not just in practice, not just citing the slippery slope argument.
Wasn't that interesting? And I think that reflects how the Commons, which of course is elected every 4 years, is focused upon politics and policy. The Lords, because you just sit there and squat there for life, has the bandwidth to consider ethics and philosophy. And because you're not worried about coming across like a crank, you can say things like Theresa May said, which is there's actually a philosophical and indeed a religious principle at play here, which is that suicide is immoral. We do actually think that. It's self-murder. You shouldn't be able to take your own life. It's something that our society ought to revolt against and push back against. So I wasn't surprised by that. The only thing I would say is that because I think the quality of argument was strongest on our side, we saw a lot of videos of both MPs and peers giving speeches that were so compelling that we watched them and thought, oh, we might win this. But what you didn't appreciate, if you sat through the hours and hours of speeches, is the many, many mediocre speeches from the other point of view that actually betrayed where the strength of numbers lie. So I think we all got a bit misled by how good people like Danny Kruger or Theresa May were. They didn't represent the numbers in Parliament.
That's it. And the speeches from the other side of the fence were largely with reference to anecdote, the emotional stories that they're otherwise compelling,
which is perfectly reasonable. Why not be moved by that? And there's a moral argument attached to that, which is I have seen or witnessed someone in pain. I don't want them to suffer, and I have no right to tell them that they should suffer. That's a perfectly good moral argument. But I do think that in general, yes, their side relied heavily upon anecdote. And that says something about the state of, this sounds so rude, but it says something about the nature of the education system in this country. I don't think that for a few generations, we've been teaching logic and philosophy, and there's very little theology in there. And I would say that of myself as well as other people. I'm not just being a massive snob. I think I know much less. I am less thoughtful than my parents or my grandparents were. And I think that reliance upon personal anecdote is the product of a long-term educational change in this country.
Yes. Now, Tim, do you see any reason to hope then that the Lords will strike down both assisted suicide and the decriminalisation of abortion, that's an idea that's being floated around? Or is that something they even have the power to do?
So theoretically, why can't they do it? Because they're not government bills. If it were a government bill, they wouldn't really be able to do it. But I doubt they're going to do it. I think they're going to raise objections, and I think they will kick up a stink. But my suspicion is it will go through. Partly because of the size of the government's majority, because of the strength of feeling, particularly on abortion. I'm afraid we are a very minority view on that, not just within Parliament, but crucially within the wider country. And we mustn't forget throughout all of this, again, I come back to the good speeches we saw, they don't reflect the overwhelming opinion of British voters. And in many ways, Parliament, they always say Parliament's at its best. Yeah, it is at its best taking a minority view. If you held a referendum on this subject, on many of these subjects, we would lose. It's because when you force someone to think hard about it, then they gradually change their mind over time, which is what some MPs have done. But most people are not like that. So my point is, I doubt the Lords is going to defy these majorities the House of Commons, or what is probably a public mandate.
Right, okay. Now, Tim, back in something personal to you now, back in 2014, as you remember, you were due to debate Brendan O'Neill on the theme of abortion culture, having been invited to Oxford by Oxford Students for Life. Under significant pressure, this event was cancelled for our audience's benefit. Now, over a decade later, do you think that the situation has got better or worse when it comes to pro-lifers and cancel culture?
You can answer that better than I can, because I don't speak at universities, I'm afraid. I mean, not because of that incident. That incident at the time just seemed to me to be funny, more than outrageous, because they had booked one college. The college was pressured into pulling out, and it did. And then they kept finding other colleges, and they went all the way around Oxford, finding places that might have hosted it and then didn't, until eventually the people inviting me suggested we have the debate in the street. And then we were into
would have been quite a spectacle.
Right. And then we were into the territory of whether or not the police might be involved. So at the time, I found the whole thing preposterous. I now realize it was actually the beginning of a trend. People tell me that it is becoming even harder to debate these things. I don't know if that's true. You can tell me. But I think actually publicly, again, partly because of the assisted suicide discussion, which has opened up this Pandora's box of philosophy and theology, I actually feel there is more open talk about life issues than there used to be. And I don't know if that's in part because of the growing voice and strength of the disability lobby, for instance. I think that's a very significant part of this. So my suspicion is it's probably still very hard for pro-life students on campus, but I actually think I don't feel like I'm taking such a risk anymore by publicly speaking out on these issues. And I tend to find I actually get quite a good hearing. I say that, of course, I should mention that the government has actually made it illegal to even pray outside of an abortion clinic.
Precisely.
So we must remember that the glass is very much half empty.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, I do think the public is more open to the debate than they possibly used to be.
Yes. Well, since you asked us initially, from our perspective, I will say that, students and pro-life societies, they find that there's both a twin attack from both the university unions themselves and, of course, other students. So various universities not allowing pro-life societies to be affiliated into the student union body. Now, thankfully, a few years ago back in Scotland, one university did that, and they were challenged legally and they lost. And so that set a good precedent. So now the persecution comes more from a pro-life student's peers than from the university itself, generally speaking. And you mentioned, Tim, buffer zones and what's going on outside abortion clinics. Now, there are two examples that come to mind, both close to home here in Scotland. Rose Doherty, who quite simply held a sign up saying, coerced abortion is a crime, here to talk if you want. That was the sign she held up. And she's twice been arrested by Police Scotland because of the buffer zones, of course. And separately, I recently had the privilege of interviewing someone called Herb Geraghty, who was from Washington, D.C., who was arrested under the FACE Act, Federal Access to Clinic Entrances Act, and was later pardoned by Donald Trump himself just earlier this year, in fact. So it's a universal issue. But the situation is particularly bad here. And I say all that to kind of preface the question, would you say that the persecution of pro-lifers is an acknowledgement that the abortion lobby and its allies don't want to debate us, but rather that they want to silence us?
Well, on that point, they daren't debate abortion, because once you begin to, the reality of abortion is brought into the public sphere. It is a subject we don't discuss. It's something we don't broadcast. It's something we don't show. And campaigners who have simply tried to show images of fetuses have been criticized for doing that. So it's bizarre how an image of a fetus in one context can be totally socially acceptable, but in another of protest is described as offensive and obscene. So they daren't have that argument. Now, again, okay, let me now say the glass is half full, because what you're describing are very sinister attempts to shut down a debate. And my heart breaks because, of course, when people protest outside clinics, the goal isn't just political, it's also pastoral. It is to direct people towards alternatives. And if they can't do that, then that's actually depriving the women going to the clinics of information about an alternative. So I'm very, very sad, of course, that's been shut down. But if I dare take an issue which is really secular, but add a little bit of religion to it, God does move in mysterious ways. And the attempt to shut down protest or prayer outside abortion clinics has had the unintended consequence of making people aware that this was going on and forcing people to discuss it. And politicians who might otherwise have never paid attention to what was going on inside the clinics have been forced to comment upon the civil liberties issue of your freedom to protest outside of it. So if you think about how we now have the leader of the free world and his administration criticizing British politicians for their attempts to shut down this kind of protest, you might argue that that is an unexpected win for the pro-life movement, because otherwise no one would know about it. And so I do think it's backfired. And I think it adds to what I'm sensing is this growing willingness to have the conversation about abortion, because it's now become about more than just the difficult question of what actually happens in the procedure. It's now a debate about, as I say, civil liberties, free speech, the relationship between church and state. It's being drawn out in unexpected ways into the public. So I'm very sad about what's happened. I admire the people who've taken a brave stand, but I do think in the long run I think there could be some unexpected grace from this decision.
And put simply, the abortion lobby wouldn't be pushing back so hard if, as pro-lifers, we weren't having success outside of these clinics. Genuine success stories where babies are being born that otherwise wouldn't have been born.
Yeah.
And you've reminded me there, MSP Patrick Harvey essentially wants to have an equivalent of abortion clinic buffer zones for the issue of assisted suicide. So within the vicinity of, whether it's hospitals, facilities, where people have gone in talking to a clinician, essentially not allowing anything other than a direct, So no persuasion is in the, I've been prompted there, no persuasion of, to consider keeping one's life is essentially within the parameters of what Harvey is saying.
In which case, we're back to what we were discussing earlier about the fantasy individualism of the liberal left, that the individual has all the facts at their hands, that every individual who shows up at an abortion clinic has gone there completely of their own free will, without any pressure from the man or from their family or their community. Likewise, that the people who've shown up to take their own life have gone there without any pressure from relatives or any pressure on their bank account or any pressure from their community. That's a fantasy. I genuinely believe that the vast majority of vigils outside abortion clinics are about providing information and alternatives. Those which are aggressive, they shouldn't happen, and they needn't happen, and the law is there to stop them from happening.
And we've had Police Scotland say they're not happening. Essentially, yeah. Now, I want to finish on a positive note, Tim. With the Met Police recently saying that they'll no longer investigate non-crime hate incidents, do you think that this signals the beginning of the end of restrictions on free speech?
Yes, and I think there's a general turn against woke, a general turn against restrictions on speech, and an unfreezing of the dialogue. As I said, there is a paradox that it has all happened by coincidence when there is a Labour majority which is open to passing even more anti-life legislation that's very sad. Nonetheless, I think it means that in a few years' time, if you get the right parliament or the right amalgamation of MPs, I think you could see a much greater openness to thinking about how do we preserve and encourage life, rather than how do we help people to end it.
Yes, yeah. Tim, we're going to wrap up there. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for defending life, arguably in the belly of the beast in the world of journalism. Thank you very much.
Arch provides counselling, compassionate understanding and support to women, men, families and healthcare professionals affected by abortion. Arch provides a UK helpline, one-to-one professional counselling and support groups. All services are provided confidentially, compassionately, without judgment and free of charge. There are many people who have been affected by abortion or know someone who has. That's why SPUC founded Arch in 1987, to ensure that no one faces this journey alone. Concerns have been raised that the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill, currently being debated at Westminster, may take 2 decades or more to become operational, if the current rate of amendments and scrutiny in the House of Lords is anything to go by. A recent bulletin from Humanists UK detailed how dozens of wrecking amendments and procedural delays could stretch the bill's passage far beyond the 2029 earliest implementation date. The bill, which would legalise assisted dying for adults with a terminal prognosis, was passed by the House of Commons earlier in 2025, but still faces detailed line-by-line scrutiny in the Lords. Commentators say the sheer volume of amendments, some designed to narrow eligibility or alter safeguards, threatens to bog down the legislative process indefinitely, leading to concerns from the bill's supporters that substantial parts of the legislation could be parked until after the next general election. The delays underscore the complexity and moral gravity of legislating for life-ending measures, highlighting the arguments from opponents of the legislation that hurried implementation risks inadequate protections. Meanwhile, pro-life organisations like Care Not Killing are urging Parliament to take the time needed, thoughtfully, to ensure that any legislation does not undermine the sanctity of life, mistakenly reduce dying to a data point, or create pressure to die rather than to live. Whether the bill becomes law or stalls, the core contention remains: should the state help the dying to live or help them to die? Separately, MSPs have agreed to request a formal opinion from the United Nations on whether Scotland's proposed Assisting Dying for Terminally Ill Adults Scotland Bill complies with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The move follows strong warnings from campaigners that the bill, as drafted, may breach international obligations protecting disabled people from discrimination and undue pressure to die. The bill, proposed by Lee MacArthur MSP, would allow adults diagnosed with a terminal illness to seek medically assisted death. Critics say its narrow framing hides broader risks. Of particular concern is how it defines terminal and whether it safeguards people with disabilities or conditions requiring long-term support. A briefing by the Scottish Human Rights Commission flagged potential problems with definitions of capacity and decision-making. The decision to seek a UN assessment is a welcome acknowledgement that this legislation carries grave moral and social implications. SPUC welcomed the step, emphasising the need to ensure that, if the bill advances, it fully respects the right to life under the Convention and leaves no room for the disabled to feel their lives are not worth living. In practical terms, the referral may delay proceedings, but proponents argue this is no bad thing when dealing with legislation about life and death. As the bill advances through Stage 2 scrutiny, SPUC has stressed the importance of strengthening palliative care and ensuring the legal architecture does not compromise the dignity of the disabled or the marginalised. A new Undercover investigation by Canadian pro-life campaigner Alyssa Golub is raising serious questions about the long-held political and media claim that late-term abortions are rare and only performed for medical reasons. The research by the co-founder of Right Now carried out the investigation while 22 weeks pregnant, visiting abortion facilities in several Canadian cities and secretly recording conversations with staff, The first video, filmed at a clinic in Toronto, was released on November the 12th. Golub says her experience exposes a myth that post-20-week abortions require medical justification. In Toronto, clinic staff told her that while they did not perform abortions after 24 weeks, Women's College Hospital has no limit and routinely accepts patients further along in pregnancy. When she asked whether she needed a medical reason, she was told such requirements haven't been in Canada since the 1960s. A doctor in the clinic described the hospital procedure as a mini stillbirth, dismissing the need for medical justification and citing socio-economic reasons such as family size or finances as valid. For Golub, who was feeling her own baby's kicks at the time, the contrast was harrowing. One day I was told the fetus comes out in pieces. The next day at my scan, I was hearing about my son's organs, she said. Canada has no gestational limits following a 1988 ruling. Despite this, groups like the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada insist late-term abortions are almost always medically necessary. The recent footage appears to contradict that narrative. Campaigners in Slovenia are preparing for a pivotal referendum in November that could overturn the newly passed assisted suicide law, a move welcomed by pro-life groups who warn the existing legislation undermines human dignity and opens the door to systematic pressure on the vulnerable. The legislation, which the Slovenian Parliament passed on the 18th of July 2025 by a vote of 50 to 34, grants terminally ill adults enduring unbearable suffering the right to end their own lives with medical assistance. It followed a 2024 referendum in which 55% of voters supported regulating assisted dying. Under the law's terms, patients must have exhausted all treatment options and must not be suffering solely from mental illness. While supporters present it as compassionate, pro-life advocates argue it signals a drastic shift in societal values. When autonomy alone becomes the metric, the right to die expands and the rights of the vulnerable diminish. As one activist put it, when autonomy becomes the supreme value, eligibility for assisted suicide tends to expand over time. The referendum was triggered after opponents gathered the required 40,000 signatures to challenge the law's implementation. They cite constitutional concerns. Slovenia's constitution states human life is inviolable, and countless real-world examples from countries with liberal end-of-life laws. The pro-life Democratic Party of Slovenia labelled the law a door to a culture of death. Clearly, the referendum is not simply a political contest, but a moral crossroads. It gives the public an opportunity to reaffirm that dignity, care and support, not lethal drugs, are the answer for terminal illness. In this critical moment, the question is clear. Does the state serve life or facilitate death? The referendum could determine whether Slovenia heads down the path of expanded death-delivering rights or turns back toward reinforcing protections for the weakest. I'm Catherine Bogler and this was SPUC TV News, bringing to light what others hide.
It's not too late to buy Christmas cards and support SPUC at the same time. These are just some of the designs available to order in our online shop. Just visit our website spuc.org.uk/shop. The address is on screen now to complete your order.
In the UK, the slaughter of animals is regulated by the Welfare of Animals at the Time of Killing regulations of 2015, which are enforced by the Food Standards Agency. For large mammals like cattle, they state that the animals, quote, must be effectively stunned before slaughter, unquote. This is done using a powerful bolt gun, which the regulations state must cause immediate unconsciousness and insensibility. Interestingly, lethal injection is not used to kill animals in UK abattoirs because it's considered contrary to animal welfare science. This is because it can take several minutes to stop heart and brain function. Injections often cause distress or convulsions before death, and they require very precise dosages, and they're unpredictable in their effects. Now, we've all heard the lazy cliche in the assisted suicide debate when someone says they watched a relative suffer and they wouldn't put an animal through the same suffering. Maybe they don't realise that what we're proposing in England and Wales and Scotland, right now, is putting people down in a way we're not allowed to do with animals. I'm Peter Kearney, and this is Viewpoint. So if large mammals in the UK must be immediately and effectively stunned as the only humane way to kill them, why is it that we seem to be ready to allow another type of large mammal, a human being, to be put down by methods which are banned for use with animals? All of the coverage we've seen and heard always sounds so gentle and positive, doesn't it? Putting someone to sleep, giving them a death with dignity, taking away their pain. So, will our assisted suicide laws, if we pass them, remove pain and provide dignity? Well, if the best research available is to be believed, they'll do quite the opposite. There'll be a lot of pain and very little dignity. In the words of Dr. Joel Zivit, a doctor and expert witness against the use of lethal injection for execution in the United States of America, quote, "I am quite certain that assisted suicide is not painless or peaceful or dignified. In fact, in the majority of cases, it is a very painful death," unquote. So why are we being sold the lie that an assisted suicide brought about by a lethal concoction of drugs will be a quick and a painless death? Quite simply, many in the medical profession, the media, and among our politicians are either lying about the reality of what they're proposing or are too stupid to discover the truth. Supporters of assisted dying like to present it as a serene, painless drift into sleep. Yet, for both euthanasia and executions on death row, the truth is far more disturbing. Paralytic and barbiturate drugs can silence the body without stopping the suffering. A patient may be unable to move a muscle or utter a sound, but the fact that they are silenced doesn't mean they're at peace. Dr. Zivit's research in the USA 10 years ago gave some shocking insights. In 2014, while witnessing the lethal injection of a death row inmate in the US state of Georgia, he noted that his fingers were taped to the stretcher. As his limbs were already bound, he asked, why tape his fingers? Only later did he discover that a previous inmate had clenched his fists repeatedly during his own lengthy, agonising 24-minute-long death. Was it pain? Was it fear? Was it resistance? It was hard to know, but prison staff had prevented subsequent inmates from making even that small gesture. In 2017, after gaining access to autopsies of executed inmates, Dr. Zivit's theories were confirmed. The Georgia inmates' lungs were twice the normal weight, and they were filled with fluid. He had suffered pulmonary edema, effectively drowning in his own secretions. Yet he showed no outward signs. Under US federal law, executions may be painful as long as they aren't cruel. The Supreme Court previously sought instantaneous death. Instead, what it seems to get now is a hidden form of suffocation. Far from the instantaneous death sought by the Supreme Court, drowning in this manner turns out to be both prolonged and painful. The same barbiturate as used on death row, pentobarbital, has been used in 4 out of 5 assisted suicides in the US state of Oregon, which is the model for our assisted dying bills. If post-mortems were routinely performed, we would likely find the same pulmonary edema in all these cases. The patients, expecting a slow and a painless drift into sleep, are choking and drowning. And unlike executions, assisted suicide deaths take place without anaesthetic. The pain may be unseen, but that doesn't make it unreal. and families know this. Linda Van Zandt, who assisted her aunt's suicide in California, described crushing and mixing 100 pills into a drink her aunt could barely swallow, forcing her to consume the vile mixture in under 5 minutes to ensure success. What torment her aunt went through at the end, we'll never know, but it's hard to describe what happened as death with dignity. Now, advocates of assisted dying owe the public honesty. Behind the rhetoric of dignity lies a grim biological reality. Many of these deaths look peaceful only because the person being put to death can't move or speak. And people deserve to know that the path they are being offered isn't sleeping, it's drowning. Separately, a recent editorial in the British Medical Journal highlighted a troubling regulatory discrepancy. The drugs used for veterinary euthanasia operate under far stricter licensing and oversight than those proposed for human-assisted suicide. The authors of the article argue that in the UK, the licensing system for medicines demands rigorous safety, efficacy, and quality standards for pets and animals. But in human-assisted dying, proposals, the same safeguards are completely absent. This double standard raises serious ethical alarm. When the substances intended to end human life are afforded less scrutiny than those used to kill animals, the message is pretty clear. Human life at its ending stages is being treated as less valuable and less protected than animal life. The implications are profound. Legislation, such as the proposed Scottish Assisted Dying Bill, completely lacks transparency about which drugs will be used and how they'll be regulated. Interestingly, Dr. Zivit met and explained his findings to many inmates on death row. Based on this pulmonary edema information, 3 inmates on Tennessee's death row considered their options. Having heard the consequences of the lethal injection process, all 3 chose to die instead by the electric chair. Not something that any of our politicians are offering though. Thanks to UK energy policy, our electricity prices are so high the NHS probably couldn't afford the electricity bills. Since even death row inmates, when presented with medical evidence of pulmonary edema, have chosen the electric chair over lethal injection, shouldn't that alone give us reason to pause? Let's ditch the "we wouldn't treat an animal like that" rhetoric. When we're talking about someone in pain, the truth is, what some of our politicians are planning to do is treat humans who want to be put to death far worse than they'd ever treat an animal. That's all we have time for this week, but please join us next week for an exclusive interview with Sir Brian Souter.
And now we're talking about allowing someone to terminate that child up to 39 weeks. This is not abortion any longer. This is infanticide. We feel it. The temptation here is going to be not to fund palliative care and to fund assisted suicide.
If you're enjoying the programme, please remember to like, comment and subscribe. And thank you for watching.